your why is partly connected to you've got some passion for cyber because you started this leadership survey specifically on the CISO community. And
Yes,
I'm
yes.
wondering why, what drew you to in all the areas of tech that you could have focused on, why did you choose to focus on the CISOs?
Yes, it's a great question. Well, just to back up a little bit about your question about my passion. So my passion is leadership, as you can tell.
Mm-hmm.
So I really think anything big that's going to happen in the world is a leadership challenge.
Okay.
The title of the book I wrote is Leadership is Changing the Game. So I
Yeah.
think the job of the leader is to take us somewhere new. You know, we do need people who manage things, who keep things going. But really, history is littered with examples of well-managed businesses that are no longer with us because they didn't reinvent, they didn't change the game.
Mm-hmm. That's
So,
true.
you know, my passion is about leadership. You know, if you boil it all down, everything's about leaders taking us somewhere. And I think, secondly, that anybody can be a great leader. You know, there's a bit of a debate in the psychology circles about whether leaders are born or made. And
Mm.
and I prefer the latter, and my experience tells me the latter that you know leaders can be made if they're willing. Now, if they're not willing, nothing really is going to change. But
Right.
people who are willing can change and take their leadership to a whole new level. And so, applying that passion to the cyber field, for a while I didn't mention earlier, a lot of my career was in Telstra, which is the major telco here in Australia,
Mm.
and always working with technical people. And then I was the CEO of a not-for-profit business that Telstra and 20 other companies here in Australia started, including Microsoft. And we were really trying to get better skills development in the industry. And the most critical one that kept coming up, and this is 15 years ago, really,
Yeah.
Dana, was cybersecurity. And nothing's changed. I think, in fact, you know, every day that goes by, it just shows the prominence of cybersecurity.
Mm.
So, you know, my thought, Donna, was, and perhaps this is a product of my grey hair a bit, that I can remember back when there was a similar rise of a job called the Chief Financial Officer.
Yeah.
Now, everybody accepts that today most businesses have a Chief Financial Officer.
Right.
But back in the mid 70s, you know, you had the person with the little green cap, and, you know, they were called a finance manager, and they were in a back room and, you know, pretty much like the bookkeeper and accountant.
Yeah.
But, you know, you can see like a hockey stick rise of the job title called Chief Financial Officer.
Mm.
So the chief came in the title, and initially it was a lot of regulatory change that drove it. And then there was a whole period during the 80s of mergers and acquisitions that said we need to have people who can help us with the strategic side of finance. So my thought is that something similar is happening in the cybersecurity field. I think the prominence of the role and the chief in the title means the expectations are rising of the business for people who can really take us somewhere new and help us deal with, you know, what boards see every day as a new threat, a new vulnerability, and they're looking out to the people and saying, well, what are we doing there? How are we managing that? And I think that means that the leadership prominence of CISOs and cyber folks in general is rising. So to recognise that, I've started the Big Kahuna Leadership Survey. I go out and interview people. The Big Kahuna idea. The Big Kahunas were the ones who rode the giant waves in the
Right.
Hawaiian surfing vernacular. You know, in this analogy, it's the big wave of cyber threat that's coming, and you know, it's the people who are going to ride that wave that I'm interested in. You know, I'm just asking them three questions. What's the leadership challenge? What's the major leadership challenge that CISOs and others face? How would you rate their leadership capability?
Mm.
And what are we doing to develop the leadership capability of those people who are playing such an important and critical role protecting us all.
That's truly fascinating. It's funny how history is that when things become accepted, we don't know the sort of the timeline. Thinking about a CFO not existing in a company, thinking about them being, they're like Bob Cratchit with his counting and his, accountants.
That's
That
all.
because my experience in business was the CFO was always very important and always on the board. And I just love that analogy that we may be in 10, 15 years, the CISO will be at that level. We're just in this transitional
I
phase.
think
I had not thought of it that way. That's really
I
cool.
think so, yes.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of the global recruitment trends, there's a global recruiter, Russell Reynolds, has developed a framework for CISO. So if you're thinking about, well, we need a CISO, what kind of CISO do we need?
Yes.
And, at one level in their model, it can be highly transactional.
Yeah.
So that's the typical, backroom, technical problem solver. But at the other end of their scale is highly relational. So influencing strategy, influencing the board, influencing C-suite, and taking the team in a new direction.
Yeah.
Now, most people are saying, well, we need the highly relational. But my point is, well, what are we doing to develop that capability? Because you can't just keep expecting to buy that capability off the shelf. There's much more sensible to invest in people and
Right.
got good people who are willing to take their leadership to another
Yeah.
level. Let's invest in building their capability. Does that make sense?
It does, and I'm curious. So for the last question is sort of it's a call to action, and I'm going to mention the Kahuna survey and call that as the last thing. But before we get to that, are there any when you're talking to somebody, what are some of the personality traits that you see in them if you're talking to future leaders or leaders who are struggling? What are some of the personality traits or some of the tactics and techniques that we can work on to be better leaders, make some of that relational aspect stronger within us, especially if we come out from the basement behind keyboards and we're used to just being very much the techs?
I love your questions. Yeah, look, maybe if we come back to this idea about reinvention, so that's a good starting point, is to first of all acknowledge, well, now I'm in a leadership role, I do need to reinvent my strength. I do have this strength. I'm a great problem solver. I've got a new problem called people. Influencing culture and influencing its teams and so on is a major problem. So, there's a kind of a phase, I think, that if you're a problem solver, the tendency is to just want to solve the problem.
Okay.
Now, not everybody appreciates you just landing them with solutions if you haven't spent the time listening to and understanding in depth what the problem is. So I think kind of the call to action would be, if you're a CISO listening to this, think, well, what can I do? How can I change my mindset? What would I do differently?
Yeah.
I think there's a big listening phase,
Uh,
to kind of, you could call it in problem solving. It's like the market intelligence, isn't it?
yeah.
If you're a business, you want to go out with, well, what are my stakeholders thinking? What are the business problems that they face? And so far in the Big Kahuna Leadership Survey, what the clear message that's coming out, Dana, is that we need to shift the conversation from technology and solutions around technology to talk the language of business risk.
Yeah.
So, a listening phase of asking them, well, what are the risks that you're
Yeah.
facing? What are the challenges that you currently have in the marketplace? And, then maybe some solutions can start to come to the fore, but people will experience that you've spent the time trying to understand their problem before just imposing a solution. May very well end up being the same solution, by the way, but it's just a different experience, isn't it? Yourself, if you've had somebody come and sit with you and say, tell me about your challenges, and now what about the risks that you face, and have you thought about this? And it makes a difference then when you say, well, now what do you think? How can we solve that problem?
I completely agree. Back when I was a consultant, that was the first thing that when we were doing any proposal, the first thing was background, and it was background on the company and their problem to show them that we had listened to them and understood their problem. And that's why we were the company that could then come in and help and consult for them. But yeah, it's that, and that listening, it's funny because sometimes when we say soft skills, it can feel like, well, but that's not tech, or that's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
that I want something more businessy sounding. But it can be as simple as listening, especially for techs, right? Because we're always, I know this new technology or this attacker's doing this thing, but what's the business really need? Just listen.
yeah, yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation.
I,
Though
it's
I'm
been great. Thank you
sad I
for
couldn't
allowing
have
me the opportunity.
a flat white while we were talking, because you're from the land of flat whites. But before we go, could you just explain a little bit more? I understand that you're still interviewing people for this Big Kahuna CISO survey or CISO survey.
Yeah,
So could
yeah.
you?
So I think we can put a link in the show notes.
Absolutely.
Yes, I'm very interested in views that people have about those three questions. What are
Okay.
the leadership challenges that CISOs and other senior cyber leaders face? And how do we rate their leadership capability right now?
Yeah.
And what can we do to develop that leadership capability? And I'm trying to get a rich range of views in that, Diana, from practitioners in the field to C-suite to board level. So really anybody that's watching this series that
Yeah.
you've put on, who thinks, oh well, that's a topic I'm interested in and got some views about. I'd love to hear from you. You can either get in contact or there's a link to an online survey. You can do it. Just takes a few minutes. But I think at some point then I'd like to come back with what I found. And, so far it's been very illuminating. I think when we bring it all together, it'll be interesting to see, well, what's everybody saying?
Yes.
Is it
Yeah. The
confirming that
finding. Yeah.
that kind of early finding is, well, it seems as if we're going to shift the conversation to business risk. Let's see. Is that what people say? And how do we do that kind of capability building? I think that'll be an interesting question that will occupy the minds of those great problem solvers.
I agree. And so when you're finished with the survey, you'll come back and tell us what you found.
I will. I'd be
Good.
delighted to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And yeah, for anybody listening, if you're a CISO, know a CISO, we'll have the link in the post here on Medium so that you can contribute to the Big Kahuna CISO survey that Brian Donovan and his leadership team are doing. So
Thanks, Donna. And thanks for what you're doing too in making the cyber leaders around the globe prominent, bringing them out and giving them this opportunity to have their voice. I think it's a similar passion that we share, that it's
yes,
it's people that are going to make the difference.
it is. Yeah. And people like you. Thank you so much for being here, Brian. And thank you everybody that was watching. We'll see you next month.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Donna. Bye.